It's the week ending Saturday, the 21st of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen more vaccines claiming over 90% effectiveness against COVID, a war crimes report implicating Australian special forces in the murder of 39 Afghan civilians, and Dominic Cummings leaving Downing Street for the last time. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Gabriel. Power from Money Week, we have Mr. John Stepek, and freelance journalist Suchandrika Chakrabarti is joining us again too. And strap in everybody, because John, you are starting the show this week. What inevitably incredibly complex story about global finance do you think this week should be remembered for?
China threw down a free trade gauntlet to Joe Biden.
Look, we're excited about the opportunities. The timing of this trade agreement couldn't be better. At a time where there's a lot of uncertainty around trade in and out of countries around the world, the signing of this agreement with effectively, a third of the world's population offers huge opportunity into the future. It's a single set of rules, some certainty for exporters in all of those 15 countries. And we believe that it sends the right signal to the rest of the world that actually open trade is the best way forward for post-COVID recovery.
Damien O'Connor, New Zealand Minister for Trade and Export Growth, speaking to Bloomberg on Tuesday. John, whatever he's on about, it sounds like he's very happy about it. So briefly, if you can, John, what is the story?
Okay, so on Sunday, what by some measures is the biggest free trade deal in history, was signed in Asia. So it covers 15 countries, including China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand and South Korea, as well as 10 of the Southeast Asian economies, places like Vietnam and Singapore. And it represents about 30% of the global economy and about 2 billion people.
And what is it called, this thing that we've all been blissfully unaware of?
It's called, wonderfully, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with the acronym RCEP. You can see why it hasn't been widely reported on, can you? I'm almost falling asleep just talking about it.
But it's significant, isn't it? Because there haven't been many major multilateral trade deals in the past 5 years, have there? The only other one is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which concluded in 2018. So why is that, and what does this mean? Yeah,
well, this one, so first of all, RCEP is a bit less ambitious than the Trans-Pacific Partnership was. At the same time, it's bigger and it's actually succeeded. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was actually originally a kind of flagship policy of Barack Obama. But then what happened when Donald Trump came in was that he actually pulled America out of it in 2017. So while that trade deal was designed to do a lot more than RCEP does, it ended up being smaller simply because the US wasn't in it. The difference here about RCEP is that obviously it doesn't cover as much. It makes it slightly easier for countries within Asia to trade with one another. And it is also significant because it's the first ever trade deal between China, Japan and South Korea. But overall, it's not as ambitious.
And that absence of Donald Trump in the TCCP is, I guess, what you were hinting at there, with the gauntlet being thrown down to Biden, right? He's going to have to deal with many major competitors working together without the US now.
Well, this is it. There's a couple of things going on here. You've now got the US. So the US isn't part of this trade deal, and it isn't part of the other major trade deal which was signed, which was the TPP, or the CPTPP as it ended up being. Let's just not even go there. So what you've got is you get the biggest world challenger power, China, already has a lot of economic clout, and this gives it even more. So China's building up its sphere of influence at a time when the US has essentially pulled back and left a big vacuum there. So that's kind of, and on the other hand, we also talk about free trade benefits. But the tricky thing is that if China is a lot bigger than all the other countries there, and it's a lot more important, and we've already seen it using its clout to pressurise Australia over its attitude towards COVID-19, for example. So there's a limit to, how much these things actually end up being about free trade and how much they end up about being the bigger partners kind of like exerting their heft over the other members.
Okay, so Chandrika, I'm going to come to you with a question now, but I should say if people are concerned that your tummy is rumbling, you do have some background noise today in your apartment, correct?
Yes, the lift is being fixed, and so there's noise down the lift shaft, which goes to all floors. So that's fun.
So excuse her if that's what you hear over her, no doubt, compelling answer to this question. So Chandrika, increasingly on this show, it feels like we're covering international diplomatic events in which China and America are pitted against each other, and it's China that is emerging as the real superpower, basically. Is that the story of this again?
Yeah, well, apparently several of the members of the RCEP were very keen to negotiate with the United States and keep them in the TPP. I'm trying to keep my letters in the right order. And they would have much preferred the US to be in charge rather than China. So they've already got that kind of slight, so this wasn't exactly what we wanted, but we'll sign up for it anyway. And apparently the TPP, which is not quite the same as the RCEP, it goes further. It was meant to be a geopolitical statement of belief in other core values that the US is meant to champion, so possibly it will more under Biden. So things like rule of law, worker health and safety, labour rights, environmental protection, which is a big one with China, and the peaceful non-coercive resolution of disputes, that's all under TPP, but RCEP does not go as far as that. And part of that could be because the US isn't there.
And Gabriel, India aren't part of this either, are they? Why?
Well, yeah, you're right, in that they were going to be, and it would have covered, it already covers about 2.2 billion people worldwide, and it would have covered an extra 1.4 billion had India not pulled out of negotiations last year because of concerns that it wouldn't be able to protect domestic industry. So in that, obviously, India, led by Narendra Modi, has taken a rather Trumpian view, clearly, of these sorts of plurilateral trade agreements and been about, much more insular and isolationist, I suppose. There's also theories that India was worried about it expanding their current trade deficits, particularly with China, and that would, worsen their economic standing in Asia. And the signatories of the RCEP have said that India would be welcome. The door is left open for them if they do want to join.
I mean, John, Suchandrika mentioned, core values. I guess because when it comes to negotiations that are in the news, the only ones that really make the headlines here are the UK's negotiations with the EU at the moment. A lot of people listening to this will just be used to the idea that all such deals have comparable amounts to say about values, about welfare standards, freedom to travel, that sort of thing. That's actually not the case with this, is it?
Oh, no, absolutely not. I think the way you can think about trade deals is in terms of their breadth and their depth. So the breadth is, how many countries do they cover? The depth is what are the issues they tackle. So the easiest thing to do is to drop tariffs, for example, on goods. So you don't charge people for, bicycle parts coming across your border. But then there are non-tariff barriers, if you like, which are things like standards, trading standards. And then you can go a bit deeper than that and say, right, well, we're going to insist that all your factories have got certain labour standards. We're going to insist that people are paid a certain amount. We're going to insist on a certain amount of kind of consumer health and safety. And so that really is about, how really, I suppose, to a certain extent, the more intrusive into your domestic rules a trade deal becomes, the trickier it gets. But then it becomes trickier to actually agree something.
And tricky maybe, Suchandrika, for developed countries to necessarily get behind it if the population did understand what was happening here, which is, I guess, why the likes of Trump and Modi don't back it, which is, people are concerned that essentially as globalization increases, their jobs are at threat.
Now, going back to the India point, their senior Congress leader, Anand Sharma, has said that India's decision to not join is unfortunate and ill-advised. So even within a major country who's not decided to join, there is this kind of like, well, I think we should, why haven't we done that? So even inside a country, there can be a bit of regret, and it's a good thing that door is open because India possibly could still join.
You've sort of nailed a good point there, in that free trade and globalisation does create a set of losers. I mean, overall, it tends to be win-win. And while it's easy to criticise America, particularly in the wake of the Trump era, you also have to remember that China hasn't evolved in the direction that the idealists hoped it would. So China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and everyone thought, oh, okay, here comes a kind of freewheeling capitalist consumer paradise. And what actually happened, in effect, is that China helped to hollow out manufacturing in the US, which led to a lot of discontent. And it is worth noting that the Democrats, particularly the more left-leaning ones, are thoroughly against free trade and globalisation as well. So this is not a right-wing issue, or certainly not a traditionally right-wing one. And China also stole a lot of technology from the US. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And this is one reason why they're now neck and neck on things like artificial intelligence. So Trump's actions were as much a symptom as a driver of all that. And it really does leave Joe Biden in quite a tricky position, because he doesn't have a lot of support from either the left or the right in Congress to retain and go back out there with America as being the big man on the world stage.
Gabriel, you were nodding along to that. I mean, where do you think this will go in the next 5 years from an American standpoint?
I don't know. I suppose that this is a sort of uncoupling, or the continuation of an uncoupling of East Asian and American economies. And it does feel like, as John was saying, quite symbolic rather than substantive. It's not hugely ambitious. And so I don't feel like America is going to be that desperately urgent to kind of reintegrate itself back into that, especially considering the RCEP is in effect just a kind of consolidation of already existing trade deals. Obviously, China's involvement, it makes it a lot more kind of significant, but it's not like the US is really being left in the kind of dust when it comes to free trade because they've missed out on this sort of agreement. So I don't think it's going to be anywhere near the top of Biden's priority list.
I mean, before we get completely lost in the weeds of this, John, I mean, just on a very simple, practical point, you've chosen this as your story of the week. Aside from the implications in years to come, like right now, literally right now, what are the implications for us listening to this? How does this affect my investments, my business, my money?
That's a good question. It's probably not the top of your worries about your investments. It will be good for the member countries at the margins.
Give me an example. Like, what's a thing that can now happen that couldn't happen before? I mean, I literally don't understand.
Oh, well, basically, for example, actually, probably the biggest impact is on a thing called rules of origin. Before this deal, you could have, the FT described it well, you'd have a company in Indonesia could be making a bike, and that might be eligible under a free trade deal with Japan, but it would need different components to be eligible for a deal with South Korea. So under RCEP, that gets rid of all that. So basically, it gets rid of a lot of paperwork, and it streamlines a lot of admin. So it's good for supply chains. The slightly trickier thing is that for certain countries who perhaps have had agreements that protect their producers in some ways, they're now going to be opened up to competition. So for example, Vietnam is a big part of the kind of secondary supply chains. And while certain people say that it's going to be good for Vietnam, others are a bit worried that, actually now this opens us up to competition from other countries that might even be cheaper than us.
I thought it was really interesting what will happen with China and Australia, because they're having a bit of a standoff. They've got a bit of a trade war going on, and they are both signatories of the RCEP. So read something and stuff, China morning paper, saying that that this won't actually fix their problems, that China and Australia have the potential to escalate their trade war. And so even if America feels like they've missed out on signing this, they can still possibly sit back and have a bit of a giggle at the members fighting amongst each other in the future.
Okay, Suchandrika, you're up next after this. Okay, Suchandrika, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Every breath you take, every move you make, your boss is tracking you.
You can see, we have a problem as people are transitioning in shifts at 8 a.m. So let's make sure that we put cones out with tape markers on the floor, or sometimes even people put hallway monitors for the period that people are changing shifts, or they stagger shifts. So it's meant to be a management tool to tell you where your problems are and where you need to make changes.
A CNN business report featuring Carter Maslan, CEO of Cameo, which specialises in AI for CCTV footage. Now, Suchandrika, I went on to Cameo, camio.com, not to be confused with the celebrity voicemail platform, and I saw the video demo that they have on their front page, which is a slightly terrifying 1984-style video portraying workers in a warehouse being tracked with blue and red circles on the floor, visually superimposed, as they walk around at work. What is going on? What's the point of that?
So this is looking at how COVID can be an excuse for companies to roll out more surveillance. So we've got the example of Cameo there with their brilliant music over that video. And then you've also got an example of a company called Radiant, who sell a stripped down Samsung smartwatch that companies are giving out to their workers. And this involves a social distancing tool. So when an employee wears the watch, they walk around their office or their warehouse, a bit more likely, and it searches for other similar devices worn by other workers and estimates their distance. So if one worker is too close or 2 meters away from another worker for more than 15 minutes, the watch will upload the interaction and where their locations are. So that feels a bit...
And then you can shoot them, right?
I mean, yeah, the aim is right there. You've got a choice of 1-2 meters from the other.
I mean, but it's a serious point. Like, what are you supposed to do with that information? Just slap on their smartwatch wearing wrist? I mean, what do you do if employees are too close to each other COVID-wise? It's kind of their personal responsibility to manage that, isn't it?
So employers are saying they're using this kind of stuff to change walkways and to change like what kind of shifts people are doing, and it's more a case of them changing their practices to make sure people don't have to pass each other in a narrow hallway or don't have to stand next to each other in queues. But it does also feel like it can watch everything they do and upload data on everything people do, and yeah, that it might be telling them off for having too much of a fun conversation with someone else.
Okay, all right. So big data could come out of this, which actually, Gabriel, you can see the use of, can't you? And Suchandrika outlined it like that. I mean, if you are a huge company, you know, a corporation with thousands of employees, then you could design your warehouses in the future to make sure there's less interaction between people that could be bad for their physical health. I suppose there's an argument there.
So yeah, I mean, what should be noted as well is that this technology itself is not new. It's been used by healthcare companies and construction firms and places where people need to be tracked for various reasons relating to health and safety and that sort of thing. And now it's just being rolled out to other companies, like one of the first companies to sign a contract with Radiant for this particular product was Ford, who obviously have a lot of manufacturing plants in the US, where worker privacy and workers' rights are a little bit more lax than in Europe. And so there's a bit of a concern over privacy. The problem is that Radiant has said that most of its data is stored on the cloud. And the cloud is in effect, I mean, not to kind of rehash an old overused in-joke, but it's basically someone else's computer. And you can say that, oh, it's safe, you know, we can store it anonymously and it's on the cloud and it will just go to your employer and no one else. But there's absolutely no guarantees that all of the various kind of third parties that are involved in the storage of this data have the correct security apparatus in place. And so it is easily viewed, and, you know, governments can request to view cloud information and cloud data. And so this is a slightly more kind of broad point about privacy, but the fact that all of the companies that have spoken in recent months about implementing systems like this have said that it's entirely up to the employers how they choose to implement it, and it's not up to the workers.
Well, I mean, let's take Amazon as an example, John, you know, which are a company who do use technology like this and do obviously have a lot of warehouses. It is their computer, the cloud, isn't it? They own the cloud servers. So in that case, you can't say they don't have a grip on the technology. They are based in the US. So, you know, this distinction about privacy at work isn't really relevant. So I suppose the extent to which Americans basically feel uncomfortable about this comes down to the fact that they might be uncomfortable with the idea that when they're on work time, they're owned by their employer. But that just is true.
I mean, yeah, that's... There's a tendency that, I mean, I guess this is what it boils down. I would take issue with the argument that you're owned by your employer. You know, you're exchanging your labour for money. There's a lot of leeway within that. And I mean, this is the tricky thing. I mean, people have always been monitored, particularly in factory settings. And one of the big issues that we've got just now is obviously with people working from home. There's suddenly a spasm of kind of employer paranoia about white collar people basically clocking off to. There was an article that went a little bit viral this week on Twitter from Financial Post, which is an Australian publication, which someone was saying, "Oh, if I were to ask whether most workers would happily accept their regular pay in exchange for staying home to bake a loaf of bread or scroll through social media, the answer would be obvious." And it's this idea that employers just don't trust people to get on with the job. I feel very reluctant about any steps towards kind of monitoring people in this way. I mean, it's more applicable to certain workplaces than others, but you've got to have a certain amount of engagement with the employees as well as to how comfortable they are with it. And if it's aimed at practical things like making sure that workflows are working properly, that's one thing. If it's sort of very closely targeted at are you skiving or not, then that sort of implies a deeper problem in the workplace culture, I feel.
But Suchandrika, you know, it's very resonant, isn't it? This idea of strapping a smartwatch to someone that's literally tracking their movements. That can feel like an infringement. But the truth is, you know, here we are now talking on Zoom, you know, an American-owned or majority American-owned platform in which we are doing work. And, you know, the terms and conditions of that company, which I have not read, will say who owns this data, and it's certainly not me. You know, we're using Slack to coordinate our ideas. That's often linked to personal email addresses. So this does affect white-collar workers working from home in ways that people just simply are not thinking about because it isn't a watch strapped to your wrist.
So I found out a really terrifying thing about Zoom, which I really want to share with all of you guys who are on Zoom right now. It turns out that Zoom has an attention tracking feature that can alert hosts if you look away. I mean, surely those are your eyes, but that's so scary as well that you can have a really huge Zoom, like 100 people and all members meeting, and someone might just duck out for a second and that will probably be noted or recorded in some way.
I'm pleased to say I saw that article myself and I was suitably terrified, so I looked it up. They did discontinue the feature. So they have the technology to do that, but they have, in response to protests about it, actually stopped doing that since April. But the point is, until people point this stuff out, that's how they behave, isn't it? That they will keep that data.
And that's a really good point about protests, Ollie. That's really helpful because there was quite like a big ruckus about Barclays back in February. So if you remember, there was a time when there wasn't a pandemic, we could go out. And so Barclays put these little devices under desks and it tracked the time.
I remember desks.
Yeah. And being an employee in an office, it was great. And so basically, if you went and did that thing where you talk to people on the way to the kitchen, where great ideas and inspiration come from, that's why we miss the office, right? If you did that little device under your desk would tell the management that you were away. And so the bank introduced this monitoring stuff and faced a massive backlash from staff, and they actually axed it. They said it was a response to colleague feedback, which is my favourite euphemism that I found this week. And they didn't say if you'd be permanent or not. Obviously, COVID's got in the way of that. But yeah, you're completely right that protest will have an effect. So companies will tend to say, we'll write anything in those terms and conditions which are longer than War and Peace and nobody reads. They'll just tick the box. But then actually, when people realise it infringes their privacy and it affects their life, they will protest. And it does feel like we are heard when we protest.
But Gabriel, I mean, you're the youngest one here, but nonetheless, we're all of an age where we're sceptical or surprised by these kinds of products being used. But for graduates entering the workplace, when finally they do, that used to be a thing that happened as well, they're more comfortable, I think, with this idea, aren't they? That anything they say on a digital platform, anything they do at work could potentially be visualized, and they keep their private lives completely separate.
Absolutely. I feel like it's more a kind of element of fatigue and acceptance that there's nothing we can do about it, rather than any sort of, acquiescence with the idea. Like, me personally, it's a bit different because my partner is a cybersecurity analyst, and so I'm constantly being warned about how everything is terrifying and everything I'm doing is being monitored. So yeah, I'm a bit of an exception, but for younger people going into the kind of, particularly in America, where, as we've said a million times already, workers' rights are much looser. As Suchandrika was saying as well, you do just kind of have to go with the flow with these kind of slightly dystopian elements of your job until it's uncovered by, an expose in a newspaper or through, a whistleblower at work or something like that. And then it all has to come crashing down. The company has to do some half-assed apology, and then we kind of reset and build back up the dystopia until it comes down again. And it's just this endless cycle, which is disheartening.
Yeah, well, first they came for the financial journalists and I said nothing, John. What would you do if your boss said, right, you've got to wear one of these watches then? Everyone in the office has to wear one. Would you be the person to speak up and say, no, I'm not doing it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. No, that's a step too far. Tell them where they stick their watch. It's, I think that. I think your point about when people do protest, people back down. I think that irritates me. And one reason, for example, I've never gone to Facebook is that the grey areas are constantly being pushed by these tech companies. And, Wired magazine has been writing about why the death of privacy would basically be the ideal outcome for about 20 odd years now. And the thing is, we need space in our lives. I'm the same as Gabriel, actually. I've got to the point where, and I drum this into my kids, it's like, never commit anything to a computer keyboard that you wouldn't be happy to see on a headline the next day in the paper, or sent to, the person that you're writing it about, because, that could happen. And also it's, you don't know who's watching. And I think the thing that bugs me about this is the level of expertise that an individual needs to get to in order to protect themselves. It's like, oh, do you accept these terms and conditions? It's 47 pages for an app that maybe, playing a stupid wee computer game or something like that. I'm not going to read that. No one's going to read that. And it's not enforceable in court because of that. But the problem is that these companies keep pushing the boundaries, and unless it's only when we notice and tell them to go away that they come back. And I think that's what worries me. It's that creep, and it's that slyness of the tech companies. And I think what we could really do is having a much more upfront conversation about it.
And Suchandrika, as ever on this show, you found a novelty military angle on this story.
Yeah, that's my thing. So the US military is buying location data from ordinary apps. So there's a slight difference here where people are choosing to use these apps. They're not having a watch slapped on them when they go into the office. So this was an investigation by Motherboard, part of Vice.com. And the US is buying the granular movement data of people from apps such as a Muslim prayer app and a Quran app that has more than 98 million downloads worldwide. So they're definitely pinpointing certain kinds of apps, a Muslim dating app, a popular Craigslist app, and those sorts of things. And that's quite worrying that they're kind of profiling certain apps and people who use them and going specifically for them. That's kind of the scariest thing of all, I think.
Scary, but, as we've been saying all along, probably there in the T's and C's. We will sell your location data. And if you're an intelligence agency, you're going to be interested in it, aren't you? You can't stop people being interested if the data is legally there for them to look at.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be a case that it just sits in a cloud for years. Someone takes a look at it and doesn't actually interpret anything from it. Or on the other hand, it could be used to actually target people. So it's really the most vulnerable in society who are at risk here. The data mining could affect workers or students who don't have many rights, and undocumented immigrants and political activists who are seen to be protesting and therefore a bit of a risk for possibly a populist government.
All right, Gabriel, you're going to be finishing the show. You're up next after this. Gabriel, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Homophobia has forced the EU to wage war on its own constituents.
We are also seeing some worrying trends. Still today, in the EU, more than 50% of LGBTIQ persons are almost never or rarely open about who they are. It means they are afraid to admit what they feel.
Viera Jourová there, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, speaking this week as she opened a debate on the first ever LGBTIQ equality strategy for the EU. That was a mouthful. Gabriel, what's the strategy? Why is it needed?
The European Commission has announced that it's launching its first ever strategy for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, intersex and queer equality across its member states, dubbed, as you say, the LGBTIQ equality strategy. It was laid out by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in her 2020 State of the Union address, and basically it proposes a number of things. Most notably, it's going to extend the list of crimes which fall under EU jurisdiction to now cover homophobic, transphobic and queerphobic hate crime, and to bring forward legislation on the mutual recognition of parenthood in cross-border situations. It's all quite, if I'm perfectly honest, it's a bit clumsily worded and it's a bit long-winded, but It's basically
Long-winded.
It's
EU law.
It's been interpreted as a show of force aimed at the governments of Poland and Hungary, where anti-LGBTIQ legislation has come kind of roaring back into the mainstream under the leadership of right-wing populists.
Like what? Because I think we knew that those aren't great countries to be gay. I'm choosing my words carefully, but broadly. What's the actual laws that they've brought in recently that are considered homophobic?
Okay, so in Poland, their right-wing leader, Andrzej Duda, ahead of his re-election earlier this year, he campaigned against an LGBT ideology and said that such an ideology, in very inverted commas, is more destructive than communism, and pledged to ban the teaching of gay rights in schools. And over in Hungary, you have Viktor Orban, who tabled a constitutional amendment last week under the pretense of emergency measures for tackling the coronavirus, which requires children to be brought up with a Christian interpretation of gender roles, and has now included the phrase, "the mother is female, the father is male," into the actual constitution of the country, and also has introduced laws that effectively ban adoptions by same-sex couples, introduced a prohibition on gay pride parades, and stripped legal recognition from transgender and intersex citizens.
So, John, if Gabriel's right that this legislation is really a sideswipe at those countries, why do you think it is that it's such a hot-button issue, this so-called LGBT ideology?
I mean, there's probably a few reasons for it. I mean, speaking as a kind of someone of mildly Polish ancestry myself, obviously Poland's a very Catholic country and still sort of quite adheres. I mean, don't get me wrong, not many traditional religions are really all for homosexual rights, let's be honest here. So it's more about the aggressiveness with which you interpret the religion rather than the actual, whether it's Catholicism or Islam or whatever. None of them are amazingly up on kind of homosexual marriage and things like that. So I think there's partly that. I mean, I do think it's worth remembering that it's not that long ago that the idea of gay marriage was a surprisingly radical idea, even in the UK. And I'm talking about, in my lifetime. And certainly the idea of gay couples being able to adopt kids was controversial at one point as well. And I'm not saying, I'm basically, social libertarian, so I think everyone should be able to do what they want effectively. However, clearly it was a big issue once in the UK. It's not that surprising that it might be a big issue now in Poland and Hungary because they're hardly as evolved as we are in terms of social attitudes.
And Gabriel, is there anything in this new strategy to allow individual nations to have a view on those issues which remain controversial, like same-sex adoption in certain countries? They do remain controversial. Citizens of those countries would expect their politicians to be able to at least put a view forward.
The packaging of the strategy is a bit odd, and it's one of those things that Poland and Hungary will look at with, I think, an element of confusion as much as other things. So on the surface, based on press releases that the European Commission has put out, it does feel a bit like a kind of, we'll fight for equality in the kind of only way we know how, which is to, promote ideas and promote integration of LGBT people in certain workplaces, which is, that's a great thing for them to say, but it doesn't really offer much concrete help to certain affected communities. But then if you look further down, and it's also, the problem with that sort of thing as well is that it is possible for the EU to impose sanctions on member states, and it has done for previous issues. And so the fact that it's willing to draw a line in the sand over, like, say, Poland's decision to restrict the independence of judges in the country, they're willing to sanction the country for that, but not for kind of LGBT discrimination issues, is an interesting one, especially considering there are parts of the strategy that promote the idea of an actual ban on things like gay conversion therapy and intersex genital mutilation and stuff like that. So they've buried all of this like genuinely decent kind of content really far down below this slightly kind of jargon-heavy literature that very much leaves the EU Commission open for criticism such as, virtue signalling or whatever it is that the right likes to kind of complain about these days.
Well, let's take the virtue signalling thing head on. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, does it, Suchandrika? Maybe the point is that particularly LGBT people would see this news coming out of the European Commission, not really be able to engage with the detail because it is so bureaucratic, but understand that the EU has their side. I mean, that is a signal, isn't it? It's a signal to the countries concerned that disagree with it, and it's a signal to gay people and other people that, their cause is being fought for within the EU, even if, frankly, nothing happens.
Yeah, it's a start, isn't it? When you hear all this really terrible news coming from Hungary and from Poland, I guess it does help reassure people, hopefully, that, for instance, if they travel after COVID's over, that in every country, their children will still be seen as legally their own, which to me just feels like such an essential kind of human right that it's kind of awful that it's so politicised. But we do have an example in Italy where there have been some really horrible crimes against LGBTIQ people, and that actually Italy's taken some action in Parliament. So there were some horrific incidences of violence, including one in which a man killed his own sister because she's in a relationship with a trans person. And so what we've had recently is that there's been a bill to make violence against LGBTIQ people a hate crime in Italy. It's also bound up in sanctions against misogyny and discriminating against disabled people. So they're kind of making a really huge bill against all kinds of discrimination. And that's gone through the lower house of parliament in Italy, and it's waiting to go through the higher house. So that feels like kind of a step forward.
I do think that it highlights something important about the European Union and just how difficult it is for them, because they really struggle to expel people. I mean, you can be much, there's quite a lot that the Polish and Hungarian governments have already done that has got nothing to do with this particular topic, that has gone past the bounds of what you would hope a kind of democracy would do, like the restrictions on the press, like the restrictions on the judges. And at the end of the day, the EU has demonstrated that it is pretty toothless when it comes to that sort of thing. You can sanction things, but that just makes the countries in question say, oh, look what they're doing to us. And also, the other things, for a lot of these things, for example, extending the list of EU crimes and mutual recognition of parenthood requires a unanimous vote from the 27 member states. 2 of the 27 member states are Poland and Hungary. They're not going to vote for it. So I think that it's a kind of, it kind of cuts to this issue that the EU fundamentally has, which is, again, it's not just a trade bloc, it's trying to become a political union, but it can't become a political union if individual countries don't want to have their laws changed at a EU level.
Gabriel, it's a 5-year strategy, ends in 2025. So final thought, where do you think we'll be on this in 2025?
I'd say we have a long way to go, and it's not just Poland and Hungary that we need to be looking at. As obviously the strategy doesn't mention them explicitly, but I feel like we do need to look beyond the borders of just those two. We can't scapegoat them for everything, because, for instance, one of the most... Well, in fact, in the announcement of the strategy, Vera Jourova pointed to a report that said that as much as 43% of the EU's LGBTIQ community feel discriminated against, compared to just 37% in 2012. So there's been an increase in that. And an example of where slightly more covert but insidious anti-LGBTQ legislation can come from would be to look at Estonia, where they're about to hold a referendum on whether or not to legalize gay marriage, which is a bit of a sad indictment of the state of LGBTIQ rights in the EU, because the country's centrist party, which won an election recently, rejected an alliance with the more kind of centre-left Liberal Party, and instead got into bed with the very far-right EKRE party, who pushed for the referendum. And the centrists have defended it as, referendum is democracy in action, when, as David Cameron learned in 2016, maybe not everything should be put to the public. And so I feel like we have a long way to go, not just in Poland and Hungary, but elsewhere in the bloc.
All right. Well, that is it for this week's Rainbow Coalition. My thanks to Gabriel, Suchandrika and John. We will be back with more news to unwrap next Friday, and we'll have a little bonus treat for you on Tuesday as well. But to get that, you will need to subscribe for free via your podcast app of choice. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.